Hello, everyone, and I want to welcome you to another episode of the Better the Pond Pondcast, the Flying V edition, where we talk to incredible people who are creating impact and ripples on the pond. My name is Warren Berry, and I'm your host and the founder of Instinctive Solutions, where we believe that everyone is an odd duck, but that's what makes them awesome. Today, our guest is Paul Martin, Chairman of the Board, Tech Canada Chair, the chair of Martin Charlton Communications, the part owner of a Saskatoon berry farm, and as we know him, the Rear Admiral of the Royal Saskatchewan Navy. Think about that for a second. Paul has been a prominent member of the communications and business sector in Saskatchewan. And anyone here can agree that he has left a lasting impression. The impact that Paul has made in Saskatchewan communities is absolutely endless. Paul is always challenging the status quo, breaking old patterns, and making them better. Paul believes that everyone has a right to express themselves and to create a world that is fair. Thank you, Paul, for everything that you do to better the pond. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Paul Martin. Paul Martin, the Rear Admiral of the Royal Saskatchewan Navy, Chairman of the Board, the master of Martin Charlton Communications, Tech Canada Chair, owns an orchard of Saskatoon berries. You know what, Paul? I am honored and distinguished to have a man such of your nature on my podcast. It is great to have you.
Well, thanks very much. And, we've known each other a few years now, and I've been sitting on the sidelines waiting for the invite to attend, to land on the pond, and to be a part of to join the big flock. And so, thank you for allowing me to attend today, participate.
Since we were out, we'll give a little shout out to Gary Maxwell, and he is the MGA Golf Tour. So I was honored to be able to golf with a man such as yourself, and to be able to rekindle our relationship and your culinary expertise. I mean, Paul, you're a man who there's no ends to you.
Well, we had a lot of fun with that, didn't we? I mean, that little crazy MGA thing that Gare organized, and I don't know if you've talked about it on your podcast or not, but I mean, this is profound at many levels. What was going on there, but here's Gare Maxwell, a guy from the Atlantic region of Canada, and he ends up kind of becoming an honorary prairie guy, and I guess that's how I ended up being the Rear Admiral of the Royal Saskatchewan Navy. If you think that through, that says an awful pile. But he comes out here and he just through sheer force of will causes this thing to occur, and you can't say no to him. You just feel the momentum and the excitement and just the passion that was attached to this. So we end up with, I guess there was 16 of us, or 12 of us, 12 of us who played. And we, thank the folks at Deer Valley for being as gracious as they were and accommodating. And in large measure, a lot of these people didn't know each other very well, or they were mostly tech members, and from my tech groups in Regina and Saskatoon, and then some connections from Moose Jaw and old radio days and that kind of stuff. But we had this little crazy golf tournament with the most haywire rules, and then did a barbecue at my place after, and it was all in honor of Gare's father, who is a retired professional golfer, and this was being done to to watch a man honoring his father and enlisting these disparate bunch of people in the other part of the planet to do this with him and share it with him. Pretty powerful stuff. And I've talked to a lot of the gang that played with us that day subsequent to it, and that was a memorable thing for them. It was so unique and different. And normally you get a bunch of guys together on a weekend, have a couple of beers and play around the golf and eat a burger or something, and that's kind of like guy fare. But this one took on a whole different complexion when we were playing for the little Jimmy Cup, and something that Gare's father had won in the schoolboys golf tournament in Scotland in, like, God knows, 1956 or something. And it just transformed it from a bunch of guys getting together and talking big to that was another level on this one, and I guess it resonated with everybody. So it was a great day, and for the participation you had and the role you had in playing, helping it get it done. It was good for all of us, good for Saskatchewan, good for man, and just good for golf too.
Yeah, absolutely. It was not just it wasn't just a little golf match. It had meaning and had purpose,
Yeah.
and hopefully we get to do it again next year.
Yeah, well, great lesson for all of us is that even some routine things that if you give a little thought to and put some energy into, they can take on purpose, and perhaps there's a life lesson in that and a business lesson in that for all of us too.
Absolutely. So, Paul, why don't you sort of get me a little bit up to speed on sort of what you're doing right now? And I know you're so actively involved, and we've only got so much time, but
Mm.
just kind of get me up to speed what's happening now before I jump into all the rest of my questions on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem. Well, you summarized it fairly well at the beginning. I am chair of Martin Charlton Communications, which is a public relations firm and government relations firm in Regina and Saskatoon. And so by being chair, it means I'm one of the founders. And, I play radio every day. I do a radio commentary on 15 radio stations. I'm the business commentator on the Rolco television stations, sorry, radio stations in Regina and Saskatoon, and that's all filtered through the PR firm. And then I'm also a Tech Canada chair, which is CEO coaching and executive development. And I've got two groups in Regina, two groups in Saskatoon, CEO in each of them, and a small business slash key group in each of them. So it's sort of future leaders. And, that takes the bulk of my time, probably, a half or two-thirds of my time. I'm also chairman of the board of the all the commercial holdings of the English River First Nation, which is a northern Dene Nation in Saskatchewan, and their holdings are pretty much throughout the province. But most people would know them. The most visible stuff is the development of Grasswood on the south side of Saskatoon, the
Mm.
Petrocan, and all of that land around. There's about 100 acres there. Keep an eye on that. That's about to get a very significant level of development here. Probably won't get too much done before the snow flies, but next spring you can expect to see quite a lot of activity there. So that one, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, maybe, but that one is quite rewarding, and it's challenging and interesting, and it's a fascinating part of what I get to do every day. And yeah, I have an interest in agriculture. Didn't grow up on a farm, but I grew up close to a farm. My grandfather and great grandfather were all farmers, and so uh, that's kind of not too far from my blood. So I have a little farmland in the Weyburn area, and then I got that Saskatoon berry orchard that you talked about with my wife and I and another couple, and it's on their land. They've got the farm up for sale, so we'll see whether or not I continue to be a Saskatoon berry farmer or not. Um, they're an interesting couple. They spend half the year here and half the year in New Zealand. She is a Kiwi, and their kids are there and grandkids are there. So, his, Charles and I have been friends forever, probably my closest friend. And he sort of said one day, "I don't think I want to see snow again." So he goes to New Zealand for the winter and Saskatchewan in the summer, and I think they're probably going to land in New Zealand. If they sell the Saskatchewan farm, then there's no ties left here because the family's all down there, and they have a home down there, and they will probably stay there. So we'll see. Maybe we'll have another crop next year, but that is you can see the end of the parade on that one. So yeah, it's good fun though.
Like,
Took
I
off about 11. We took off about 11,000 pounds this year,
oh
and
geez.
we do that all with a hand pick. We don't use machinery, so if we had to use the machine, we probably would have doubled that.
Mm.
But it's there's a little cultural thing in that too, in that you'd be surprised. We do only you pick, and you'd be surprised how many people show up, and they'll just say, I remember distinctly one conversation with a woman who said, "I really don't care uh, if we get any berries today." She had our two little kids with her, and she said, "I just want the kids to experience picking berries," because she said one of my fondest memories of my time with my grandmother was to go picking berries in the wild, and I want my kids to have that. And I thought, wow, We're providing sustenance and a lovely treat to put in a pie, and it is a food, but there's another level here on this one too that was really quite striking for me. And so, anyway, it's kind of fun to get close to the ground and grow stuff and see if you can, have a crop or a harvest at the end of the year.
But isn't that interesting? You're taking something, Paul, as a blueberry farm, and actually helping expand family tradition.
Yeah, yeah, and you realize that in a sort of anthropological sort of way that people who grew up on the farm, you could never really separate the farm from the life, right? It was a
Right.
lifestyle, and so if you can, people have left the farm, moved into an urban environment, but if you can create an opportunity for them to go out there and to participate, even for a few hours, and
Mm.
to share it with the next generation, it's a potent kind of a thought process. And I must say, we started growing them for all different reasons than that. Mostly it was because I have a big mouth and I was running around the province in those days. Uh, this was 20, 25 years ago. And I was doing a presentation, something called Action Saskatchewan, a blueprint for 2005. So it was in the lead up to Saskatchewan turning 100. And we kind of posed the question of what does the province want to look like in its second century? So, you know, a few of us got together and we cobbled together some thoughts on this. And one of them was that agriculture was undervalued, not in the context of we didn't value it, but it was that Saskatchewan agricultural production focused on low value, high volume, small margins. So we're massive volumes of grain, for example, but really low price. And so what we couldn't get in price, we'd make up in volume. And so we did a calculation of revenue per acre in every province, and Saskatchewan was dead last. And we have half the farmland in the country, but on a revenue per acre basis, we were absolutely dead last. We were running around like $90 an acre back then. And so part of what I was doing running around the province was challenging farmers to get more. We'd gone through the period of diversification, so we'd added canola to the mix. And then I said, let's get into intensification. And I used the example of Saskatoon berries. And when we had Expo in Vancouver, Saskatchewan had this great pavilion. I think it was 86 or 88, 86, I guess. And we were like the third most popular pavilion on site, and it was about the traditional fowl supper. Uh, People would line up for this thing. We had a turkey. They served a turkey dinner, traditional turkey dinner with Saskatoon berry pie at the end every day at the pavilion through the World's Fair, and so it became the site. And then, after it was all over, we slapped ourselves in the back, said, "Great job," and never really did anything with Saskatoon berries again. And I'd run around the farm to these farm communities and farm meetings, and I'd be speaking, some fertilizer sales company would have me in to speak to their clients or something. And I'd show them $88 an acre, Newfoundland, 4,400. I mean, Newfoundland, that heartland of agricultural output in Canada, was like, 50 times more output per acre than we were. And that would open some eyes. And then I would tell them the story about, people line up from all around the world to taste our Saskatoon berries. And what do? We turn it off and say, sorry, no more available. If you want some, sign up for a fall supper. I mean, how much more market analysis do you need than the world standing in line for, 4 hours wanting a piece of our pie, and we refuse to give it to them? So I would talk like this. And my buddy said to me one day, "Hey, big mouth, I got some land here. You want, put your money where your mouth is." So, okay. So we threw in a few trees, and that next year led to a few more. And then, within 3 years, we had 10,000 trees in and 20 acres, and we became one of the larger producers. But, it's been a real labor of love, and it's been spectacular. And all of the stuff that you get, growing stuff, the pests and pestilence that we've had. Greatest pest we've had, moose. They come in and did a lot of damage to the orchard in the winter, and so, yeah. Anyway, I digress, I guess, but that's really where it came from.
So now your next campaign is creating moose repellent.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know what happened in this year, but there was no moose this year. They didn't get there through the winter. We had a lot of snow. I'm in southeast Saskatchewan, east of Regina, and northeast of Weyburn, and we had probably 6 to 7 feet of snow in between the trees, and they didn't get in there, and we
Mm.
haven't seen any moose since. So I'm kind of thankful for that. They don't belong down here, and so it's good that they're gone, and we didn't have as much. We didn't have any damage this year, but about 3 or 4 years ago, we actually lost the entire crop to them.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, so we had a herd in there, and we couldn't get rid of them.
So any of my listeners who are listening that are south of the border of the Canadian border will just hear that it had 6 to 7 feet of snow between the trees.
Yeah,
Only to
and
be
for those who
appreciated.
Yeah, and for those south of the border who have no idea what a Saskatoon berry is, it looks like a blueberry, but it's actually a member of the apple family. It's a native plant that is native to this region. So there's a little bit in the top of North Dakota, and maybe Montana might see some, but they're mostly Saskatchewan and Alberta. And they were a staple of the diet of the First Nations people years ago, and they are a treat. And if you have tasted them, there's not very many people who don't like them, and they're fabulous in a pie. And the best treatment I've ever had is a Saskatoon berry compote on a piece of salmon, barbecued salmon or grilled salmon. Yeah, it's it. There's a combo there that's really outstanding.
Hmm. So we will indulge, Paul.
Yeah. Yep,
Okay, we'll get to
absolutely.
you. We'll get
We
to you.
might
We'll
have
make
a
it.
few berries left at
Okay.
the end of this year. We had a great sales season. We didn't have much left for ourselves.
Yeah. Yes, the cobblers kids have no shoes. So
Yeah.
so Paul, I wanted to take you back. You sort of mentioned a little bit saying about your grandfather was in farming and whatnot. And so can you take me back? What got you from being a gosling? And I'm talking a gosling. I mean you're
Yeah.
when you're hatched, like with your humble beginnings, to leaving the nest when you decided to go it on your own to where you are today. So, Paul Martin, what is your backstory?
Well, I was raised in a small community north of Weyburn, population 50 when the Gophers are up, is what we used to say. A community called Sadu. Nobody's ever heard of it, really. But it's on Highway 35, 15 miles north of Weyburn. And my dad was the rural administrator there. And his father was a grain buyer and had some land. And his grandfather uh, came to Saskatchewan in about 1908, somewhere in that period, as a homesteader. And he was a real fire plug, that guy. J.B. Martin was his name. And he he got a homestead for himself and one for his own father. So JB Senior and Junior both came out, and they were in that Radville, southeast of Radville area,
Mhm.
southwest of Weyburn. And we still have some family down there, actually. And I was down. I like to hunt and chase upland birds and pheasant country down there. And so we were actually down on the old homestead just a couple of weeks ago, and took my granddaughter down there. And there's an old country church, Source Valley Church, stands in the middle of nowhere on a hill, and there's a little graveyard beside it, and all of my ancestors are in there. So I had my granddaughter out there and took a picture of her. My son was with us. I had the camera, but we had 7 generations standing on the gravesite. Yeah, and
Wow.
yeah, that's pretty amazing, actually. So the roots in Saskatchewan are deep, but as I say, didn't grow up on a farm, but Dad was a rural administrator, so we were very close to agriculture all the time. Then we moved into Weyburn. I was about 10 years old or something, and that's where I finished out school. And I am a proud graduate of went into Weyburn Collegiate Institute and came out of Weyburn Comprehensive School. So they changed the name while I was there. I was student body president, so it probably tells you where this whole stuff
Hmm.
started, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, so I came out of there, and I made a failed attempt at university, so I'd gone back to Weyburn, and it was a period of time when there was lots of opportunity, sort of not like unlike right now, where there's more jobs than there are people to fill them and that kind of stuff. So I'd kind of gone home to break the news to my parents that I would be not returning to the university in the spring semester, and we went out for dinner, and we were sitting at the table next to us was the owner of the radio station, and he said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I said, "Not really anything." And he said, "Well, why don't you come into the station in the morning and we'll see what we can find." And so that's how I got hired. I started in radio, And in January, we'll mark the 50th year being in radio in Saskatchewan. And
Hmm.
so so that's how it all began. And from there, it was journalism, and that led me to Regina, then ultimately Saskatoon, back to Regina, and worked in all the media from started in radio, but then did print with Saskatchewan Business Magazine, which led to a television show on CTV, the local affiliates here in the province called Saskatchewan Business, where we did the first 1 hour documentary every month on business stories in the province. And then that led to, I had a newsletter going at the time covering major political events and stuff. And then the Star Phoenix had an opening, they needed a business editor. And so we went back and forth for a while. And ultimately, I ended up there, still doing radio and television all the way through that. So I was working in the newsroom and the newspaper in Saskatoon, doing television hits from there live, and doing radio every day on all the radio stations around the province. And it was kind of funny because there was some resentment in the newspaper newsroom to me doing television. They thought I was demeaning newspapers and kind of stuff. And I was the interloper anyway. I didn't start out in newspapers. I started in broadcast. So there was a bit of a belief of purity in the newspaper business in those days. They were the media of record, and that television was just show business, and there wasn't any value in it. Blah blah blah. Then Izzy Asper came along and bought the newspaper chain after he owned what was Global in those days, before Global. And the first thing he wanted to do was merge all of this stuff. Convergence, they called it, was to put the newspaper folks on TV. And they saw the writing on the wall, and then pretty soon they were at my desk saying, "So, how do you do this TV thing?" So I went from pariah to preacher, and it was a sort of a fun experience. But yeah, I guess maybe I was one of the originals doing that. I was there first, doing all the media all at the same time.
So, Paul, I have a question for you with all that is, you got, if you look at your career in radio and television, everything you've had to do with business, it all starts from a conversation over dinner where, the owner of the radio station says, come in and see what we got. So what was it about it when you started off that got you attracted into this industry?
Yeah, well, there is a little bit more to the backstory. When I graduated from high school, one of my classmates, his grandfather was one of the original cabinet ministers in Tommy Douglas's first government. So, this will give you an idea of order of magnitude. In 1944, Tommy had a cabinet of 7, him plus 6. Today, with regional representation and all of that sort of stuff, you need to have at least 20. Canada has 40 cabinet ministers, and the US has 12. So you tell me that, prime ministers do you really need? But anyway, there had been he was like a maverick kind of guy, and so he was the guy who opened up the North. He started Northern Air Service. He put the air ambulance in place, those kinds of things. And in recognition of his contribution, a lake was named after him, way up north, east of Stony Rapids. So when we graduated high school, the two of us decided it would be a really cool idea to go up and build a cabin on Grandpa's Lake, on Phelps Lake, it was called. So I tagged along with my buddy who was doing this in honor of his grandfather. And so we spent the summer up there, and then we came out, Dave got a little sick, so we had to come out early. But we got back I got back to Weyburn, and summer holidays still on. And then we were in a federal serendipity. I ended up being invited to drive the candidates truck around for the federal Liberal Party, and so that put me in touch with the radio stations and that kind of stuff, and that's kind of where it started. It was actually Wayne Mantika, who's a name that many people will know around here, who's like a veteran of television, was working in the Weyburn radio station at the time, and he would interview me now and again about what the candidate was doing. And then he said to me, you should be in radio. And so that's kind of how it started, actually. And I had a high school teacher who told me, you have a voice for radio. You should think about that. So now it's starting to pile up on me. So, and the radio station guy says, "Why don't you come and see what we got?" I thought, okay, that's enough signals.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Tap, 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 tap,
yeah,
and then the
exactly.
whack, right?
Yeah.
And and the thing is, you've had, I mean, Paul, you've had such an impact on the people of Saskatchewan and in the business sector on so many levels of
You
just,
know, I'm going to cut you off there just because you offered up a question that sort of has some meaning for me, and I cannot answer that. And that question, like I ponder my own self. Like you look back in your career and you say, what impact did I have? You hear young people saying that they impact I had, my career in media had on the business community. I know it was something because they allow me to keep playing, but I really can't measure that. I have to get you to tell me that, right? And similarly, probably uh, when you reflect on, what impact you've had, it's probably too narrow for you to be your own judge on that. You need others to offer that input. And it's an interesting question because, I'll even ask my tech members. I say to them, I have no idea what impact I had as a member of the media, and I need you to tell me that.
well, when we post this podcast, that is a question I'm going to ask Paul, and then we'll get that message back. That's a very interesting way of putting that.
Yeah, well, I had I put something out the other day, and I got this response on LinkedIn. It was a LinkedIn thing, and it was just some fellow who, he's a contact of mine, and I wouldn't say that we know each other very well or whatever, but we know each other in business. And he just said he actually posted this, that going through university, I always had clippings on the wall, and many of them were Paul Martin clippings from the newspaper, and I can't know those stories. People have to tell me that, and that provides you with some fodder to get up in the morning and try harder tomorrow.
Hmm. Absolutely. But I will say though, Paul, I mean, I mean, without getting into detail on the podcast here, but you have had such a significant impact. And I hope when we put this out that we'll be able to get you some more of that information to see just exactly how much impact you've had, because it is, it's very relevant.
No one will be more interested to find the answer to that than me.
I mean,
So,
yeah, exactly. So, uh, so
yeah.
Paul, I'm going to move on here. I'm going to be a good steward of time. So what's the biggest thing that's happened to you that's ruffled your feathers, and how did you respond to that?
Yeah, you know, this might sound a bit peculiar, and it really is kind of one of the lessons I've learned is I had and I was face to face with a very profound uh, news development, if I can put it that way. And I really didn't grasp it at the time. I had no idea how big the story was. And I treated it somewhat superficially, I think, only because I didn't try harder or whatever. And it took me some time looking back to realize, holy smokes, you were right there on the emergence of a massively big trend, and you didn't recognize that it was a big trend. You just sort of, it was an interesting story, but you didn't get behind the story. So I don't know how much time we've got, but if you want me to elaborate a bit, uh, was traveling as a journalist with Mike Harcourt, who was the mayor of Vancouver at the time, went on to be the premier of British Columbia. But he and I had gone over to Asia, and so we'd spent a few days in Hong Kong, 4 days or so, and then we went up to Guangzhou as China was just opening up. This was in the 80s, and we spent 3 days there, and it was my second or third trip to China. I really was still pretty much, wide-eyed about the whole place, and realized that something big was there simply because of population.
Mm.
And so we went to this meeting. He invited me. He said, I got to go meet the mayor of Guangzhou. Do you want to come along? And I said, absolutely. So it's just the two of us. And he said, well, meet me in the hotel lobby at 6:30 on Saturday night. And I said to him, well, why would you go meet the mayor at 6:30 on a Saturday? And he goes, they tell me it's because that's when we can get there. So we had a police escort and all of that business. And we jump in the limo and off we go. And it took forever to get to City Hall. And I remember coming around this one corner, the traffic was just crazy. There were so many people. And came around the corner and there was a chalk outline of a body on the pavement. I mean, it was just like there was simply people getting run over and everything. And so we get to the meeting, and Harcourt says to him, the two mayors just sort of trading war stories. And Harcourt says to him, what's your biggest issue right now? And he said, well, I have the city cordoned off by the military. And Mike said to him, why would you do that? Right? I mean, you're not at war or anything. And he said, well, look, you were just in Hong Kong and you saw what was going on. And when we were there, Hong Kong was a community of about 6 million people at the time, but it had 8 million jobs. So you think it's a labor shortage around here right now. Try that one on for size. So what they did was they pushed 2 million jobs up the Pearl River into Guangzhou, into the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, as they called it in those days. Chinese government was just trying to figure out how to respond to this because they knew they wanted to open up to a Western style economy, but they, had no experience with it. And so all of a sudden, 2 million jobs get dumped on them. And the mayor says, so I've got people moving from the farm. They were communal farms in those days, very, sort of primitive.
Mhm.
And they're moving into the city to take the jobs in these factories that were opening up. And, fast forward 30 years, you know what China is about production.
Mm.
But, and so he said, they're coming in at a rate of 6,000 people a day. And I can't accommodate them. I don't have housing for them. So I've cordoned off the city with the military until I can get some housing built. So here's what I came away with. The story that I came away with was there isn't a mayor in Canada that wouldn't kill for 6,000 jobs. And this guy's getting it every day. What I missed was 500 million people moved from the farm to the city in China, created the biggest middle class in the world, and profoundly changed the economy of the planet. And what that meant for Saskatchewan was when you move into the city and you have a steady paycheck, the first thing you demand is an improved diet, more protein. And that trickled down to Saskatchewan farmers ultimately getting into the production of pulse crops. And the fertilizer industry having to expand dramatically, $30 billion getting done expansion and the like, to accommodate producers around the world having to, increase their output to meet the demand that was coming from this new market. And so I kind of missed that story. Just as an aside for those who are outside of the region, pulse crops are legumes and things like peas and lentils and chickpeas. Big in North Africa, Middle East, Indian diets, but they're high in protein. And Saskatchewan went into production of them. We had been just at one point just wheat, oats, and barley. Then we added oil seeds with canola and flax. Then we added this pulse crop. So now we have a sort of 3-crop rotation: pulses, coarse grains, and oil seeds. And we went from zero production of pulse crops to 5 years later being the world's leading exporter. And that's kind of remarkable to go from zero to world domination in 5 years. Even Microsoft didn't do that, right? That's how good Saskatchewan farmers are. So anyway, I look back on it and I say that ruffled my feathers because I missed the story. And I didn't serve my audience well because I simply didn't have a life experience enough to understand. And maybe no one did. Nobody had seen this kind of migration before and change around the economy. But it's one of the things I'm sort of self-critical about is that I missed that story. I did get a story, but it wasn't the story.
Yeah, and I guess when you look at something that happened that fast, Paul, I don't think could anybody ever saw that coming. I mean, and you think of a story happening in China and how that the trickle down effect into Saskatchewan pulse crops. Like who puts those two things together? I mean, that's really pretty phenomenal. And I And I'm assuming over time that you also have shared that story for Saskatchewan, and how what an impact that it's had on a global scale.
Yeah, but it changed the way I approach stuff now. And so, when people say, what lessons do you want to impart to people, is don't miss the big trend. I mean, pay attention to the big trends. There's the small waves that lead into the big wave. And so just scratch your head a little bit, spend some time thinking about it, devote some energy to waste a few calories and trying to figure out, is there a bigger story here?
Exactly. So we're gonna get, and I will get to that question, and then you'll probably come back around on it. So Paul, and I'm going to come back into your days now, presently, of more with this question of being in Tech Canada. Is, as a geese flies 71% further and faster when flying in the V formation, so that they're better together, obviously. So what do you think is the secret to getting a team flying in the V formation? And I look at that for you of even leading your people in Tech Canada.
Yeah, for me, it's pretty simple. It's always just challenge the status quo. Always look to improve. So as soon as you get something well oiled and working, then break it, and just try and break it again, and constantly trying to improve. And it drives people nuts that I worked with, because they get something going nicely, and I'm trying to figure out how to dismantle it and retool it. And not everybody's built that way, that they don't want to always improve. They're looking for more stability. I'm looking for less stability.
Hmm. Okay. Hey, just as an off, you turned your camera off. Was that intentional?
Yeah, I've got some internet connection
Yeah, I
problems
was
here,
kind of
so
getting a little
I'd
bit glitchy
rather you
there, so
heard me.
that's fine. Okay. No, that's great. And again, being a good steward of time. So Paul, what are you doing right now to better the pond? And
Yeah.
what ripples are you creating out there in the world?
Oh boy, that's a hard one. Again, it's one of those things that you always ask yourself, am I the right one to assess it? But let me tell you about the things that I think about in answering that. One is my role as a board chair of a First Nations company. Uh, the First Nation that I work for is very forward thinking, in the context of, they some time ago made a decision that they needed to separate business from politics. Uh, the underlying driver here for them is to create a sense of self government. This is something First Nations are striving for, and it's a noble cause in my view. Everybody deserves to be able to chart their own course and their own destiny. And when you haven't been able to do that for some period of time, it's hard to figure that one out. So what they've decided is they should not put any of their elected chief and council on the board anymore. So there were several of us from the business community who were invited to create to be on the original board, and a couple of experienced community members who are members of the First Nation, but they have business experience and they aren't elected to anything. And so we comprise the board. We have 14 operating entities that we look after. The mandate is generate enough dividends for the First Nation that we do not need to rely on federal transfers for our existence. We want to be independent. And so if you take that extension, that if you're a nation, a First Nation, uh, but somebody else is paying the way, you're not really politically independent. So for political self-determination to become a reality, it starts first with economic self-sufficiency.
Mhm.
So until you're economically free to make your own decisions and pay your own way, you're never really going to have the license to be politically free. And so that's our mandate. Take that pretty seriously. We're among of the 700 First Nations in the country. We're probably in the top 10 or something like that in terms of economic development. We're about to announce the completion of some infrastructure development just outside of, really on the outskirts of Saskatoon. We built a wastewater treatment plant. It's being commissioned right now as we speak, and will serve the regional area around the city of Saskatoon on the south side. And The rural municipality has stepped up and wants to partner with us, and they're quite supportive and they're embracing the ideas. So now you have a First Nation that's becoming the catalyst and facilitator for economic development for the non-First Nations community.
Mm.
So interesting development. So when I look at, trying to create ripples, the role of First Nations in the community and the broader economy is one that I see as, something I can play in and is worthy. Also, in my role as a tech chair, people, they use the term coach, business coach or executive coach, and that. And I do not like that word at all. And I come back to my journalism connections. Is that as a journalist, if I was at covering a sports event, I'd be in the press box, and I would, report on the events going on the field. I was never on the field. I was always an observer as a journalist, right? Well,
Mhm.
as a tech chair, if I'm a coach, theoretically, I'm on the bench calling the shots. I am not doing that. I mean, the owners of their businesses run it. So I say I am not actually the coach. I'm still an observer and commentator, but I'm not in the press box anymore. I'm just way closer to the bench. I'm
Mm.
right beside the players. I'm in that first row behind them. I'm tapping the coach on the shoulder, but I'm not actually a participant. I'm not calling the shots, nor am I on the field. And so, I see my role here is to draw observations and to be another set of eyes for people to observe, provide my perspective, and they see it differently than I do because maybe I'm a little higher up and I can see the play a little differently. And the journalism and the kind of, this would be my character piece in here, is that I really believe everybody has a right to express themselves. I'm a kind of a believer in that, and I think that's being tested pretty sorely right now in Western society because political correctness is getting in the way of some of that, and actually just plain pure political opportunism is getting in the way of it. And I think that our political leadership could use some lessons on how to do this game better. I mean, one of the it's that two-edged sword, social media and all that sort of stuff, and what we have through uh, the digital world is instant access to opinion, and we can sample and poll everything. And so the politicians tend to play like the tit for tat is always based on like the last 7 seconds of play, as opposed to what's the grander story here. And so we need to, again, missing the big trend, right? Uh,
Mhm.
uh,
Uh, Paul, I got a question for you. I'm gonna just go back, to your high school days when you said that you were student body president way back then. Looking back, were you doing the same thing then as you are doing now, and allowing other people to have a voice, or as you say in your words, giving people the right to express themselves?
yeah, I don't think I understood it as well then, but probably those instincts were there. And there's a degree of fairness that's attached to all of this, and I'm a kind of a believer in that. And I always ask the question: is fairness a Canadian value? And most Canadians would say, yeah. And then I challenge everything that's unfair in the country, right? So kind of hold the mirror up. But this was a profound exchange that I had with my father, and he was a board member of a credit union for 25 years, and I grew up understanding the power and value of a co-op in a community. And I asked him what the difference was. What's the difference between a corporation and a co-op? And I was probably about 16 at the time, and I understood the words basically. And he just said, you know, one share, one vote, or uh, many shares, many votes. And it didn't really matter in the co-op structure how many shares you held, you had one vote. But in
Mhm.
a corporate structure, the more shares you had, the more clout you had. And I thought, that's fair. And so I opted to being, less of someone leaning towards public ownership and even cooperative ownership, and more towards one of private enterprise. And it was sort of struck me as, yeah, if I invest more and have more equity, I deserve to have more say. Now, I still believe in the co-op structure, and that I am a member of a co-op and a credit union, for example, but I don't live that every day. I am much more of I would say, a commercial enterprise, free enterprise, capitalistic sort of mindset, and that is would be my default position. And so for me, that is one also of fairness. And sometimes when I'm having those days when you're grumpy or whatever, and I read a story about a union, for example, I get a little grumpy because I say, there's a guy who just wants to run the company without having to go through the trouble of buying it. And, I just don't think there's any equity or fairness in that one. Now, I get, it started out as collective bargaining. I get that, but it's gone way beyond that. And when management actually has to put in the collective agreement, management holds the right to manage, strikes me as somebody was overreaching, and we had to, push them back by putting bold-faced comment like that into the contract.
No, exactly. Again, and again, being a good steward of time, I got one last question. I had two actually short questions for you, Paul. What's one lesson that you've learned, along your journey that you'd share to an entrepreneur starting a business today?
Yeah, I am going to allude back to that one I talked about earlier, which is don't miss the big trend.
Yeah.
If there's anybody on planet Earth who's figured that one out, it's Elon Musk. I mean, he's been able to parlay it to convince enough people to fund them. But you think back to the people that really made the big differences. They identified a trend and they magnified it. So, whether that's Steve Jobs or, pick a character, Bill Gates or whatever, they figured something was moving in a direction. They got ahead of it. And we've seen them for all time. Henry Ford, I mean, pick a name, and you see it in the political world too. And, which are the leaders that actually make stuff happen, and those who are just names on the scrolls of history. So for me, it is always test yourself and try to figure out what's the bigger story behind the story, and how do I position myself to not only ride the wave, but maybe to magnify the wave. I would say that at a certain point, Elon Musk started to create the trend as opposed to, reacting to the trend.
Right.
He magnified it, but he was the most well positioned. Because he was ahead of everybody, he could set the context in which we would have the conversation. And so we were all playing with one hand behind our back, and he got to use both hands and a stick.
Fantastic. So one last question for you, Paul. If you were standing on a mountain and the world was intently listening to you, what would you say?
Wow. I'd probably something around the line of, express yourself. So it is that sort of basic, right? That, in a Western society, we have, it's very adversarial. If you look at our institutions, the legislature, the courthouse, there's two sides, right? We have clashing views. We have opponents, right? We have in a legislature, or we have the two sides of the aisle where you're supposed to go in there and debate context and concepts, and so the media in its original context was designed to be there to amplify the minority voice, which is really because you and I have the right to hold a dissenting opinion. That's the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. Is in a democracy, we can be dissenting. We can be in opposition. In a dictatorship, you can't. And so this is where I get concerned about, political correctness and some of these things, is that they're trying to squelch those opposing voices. And I would say, don't be afraid to express yourself. And I'm critical of my colleagues in the media who have fallen for that a little bit. They aren't challenging themselves enough to say, here's an example. We've now come to the conclusion that the science is set on climate change, right? So, we all talk about there's no denying the science. Well, in theory, then then the media should move to the other side of the equation and stop championing the climate change story and become the critics of it. They should become cynical of it, because that's the minority position, according to the science is now clear. And they haven't made that transition. And, it's too easy to get comfortable in kind of being a mouthpiece for a viewpoint. And really, we're not supposed to. I took a writing course when I was 19 years old. This was a workshop at a news directors conference. It was by a guy named Ed Bliss, who was the lead writer for Walter Cronkite. And before that, Edward R. Murrow, who is the grandfather of broadcast news and the first anchor of CBS. And people will remember him as the war correspondent in World War II with CBS in the US, who said, "This is London calling." Right? That was Edward R. Murrow. He came back. He was the first anchor of television news. And he had a belief that there was no room in a news story for an adjective or an adverb. It was a fire, not a big fire. And the building was destroyed, not totally destroyed. And so twice a week, Bliss said, I would try and put an adjective or an adverb into the news copy, and twice a week, Murrow would strike it, and became a contest to see if I could get one past him. Well, now fast forward to today, if a news story isn't filled with 67 adjectives and 552 adverbs, it's not a story anymore. And I think, man, maybe we could use a little Ed Bliss, let's tone this down and get it back to providing me with some information and context, and less preaching to me about a political position. And cable television has been, especially cable TV news in the US, has become so partisan and politicized that it's not news anymore. It's more like it's like we used to have. Here's a little known fact: in Canada, in the old days, the US in the old days, every political party had a newspaper. So if you look at the newspapers in most major cities in North America, they're hyphenated names. It's because there used to be two newspapers that competed. One was Republican and Democrat in the States, one was conservative and liberal in Canada. Eventually, the business model failed and they had to merge. So the Leader Post in Regina was the Leader and the Post, the Star and the Phoenix, the Globe and the Mail, right? And you look at some of the American names: the Arizona Republic, formerly Republican, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I mean, they've actually got the political titles right in the damn masthead,
Right.
And so, we've had these pendulum swings before, and maybe we'll see it go back the other way. But I went way over my answer time for a short question, so sorry about that.
But I do love a good story, Paul. I do love a good story. So, so you know what, Paul, I really want to thank you sincerely for your time today. Thank you for your story, and I really do thank you for everything that you do to better the pond. As I said, we'll find out what that impact is, but I think it's really clear that you have left a mark on Saskatchewan, and I think even bigger than Saskatchewan, into Canada. And you're definitely someone to listen to. And if people want to find you, Paul, where do they go to find you?
Well, find my stuff, probably the easiest to find my content, or Martin Charlton Communications .ca, and you can sign up, and I'll send all my stuff to you every day, and then you'll receive it in your mailbox, free of charge.
For the low cost of free.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So people know where to find you. Thank you for doing what you're doing, Paul. Always great to see you again. I think that a little bit of salmon with some Saskatoon berry compote, if we can make that happen, that'd be fantastic. Yes, and I do, again, as I said, I appreciate your time. So this is Warren Barry, and I'm flocking off to take you beyond the pond to better the pond, because we're better together. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.